Sam Seder and Vigeland on the Majority Report. I still am having trouble pronouncing your name now.
It's only
she's
been
new.
over
She's
4
new.
years, yeah.
I had it down for the first 3.5 years. I want to welcome, I think back, because we must have, you must have been on the show in one iteration or another, Paul Glastris, editor-in-chief of the Washington Monthly. Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here.
So, Paul, let's start with this. I mean, we're talking about the abundance agenda. Some people may not know what this is. Before we get there, let me do something that my one of my religious studies professors once told me to do always when I was approaching anything I've read, is like, get a sense of what the priors are of this person, and so much will make sense. So, like, place for us, because this is both a sort of a policy prescription argument, but it's also, there's a big political argument that's really at the heart of this as to like where we're going with the Democratic Party. Place yourself in this ecosystem, if you will, so we get a sense of like where your critique is coming from, because it's largely a technical critique in many ways, not an ideological one. But give us a sense of like, you know, where you are within that spectrum of the broader Democratic Party.
So, you know, the Washington Monthly is kind of issue specific politically. As you said, we focus on policy solutions and political reality, not ideology. And so on some things we're pretty, moderate or even conservative. Other things we're quite wildly lefty. It all depends kind of on the issue. I would say that a lot of the abundance folks are a little bit the same way. They're not necessarily doctrinaire, old-fashioned liberals or progressives or whatever. I guess we come at it with the idea that, yes, abundance is a good thing. We do think that there's a problem in the world, in America, of people having given up on the idea that we can have progress, better lives, and so forth, and that there are certainly ways that are constraining the economy, constraining the society from achieving those ends. They are kind of, to sum up their argument is essentially various kinds of government red tape, local zoning ordinances, federal environmental statutes, processes within bureaucracies. This red tape is holding back the production of goods that we all need. Affordable housing, transmission lines to move electricity from solar and wind farms into the metro areas where the power is needed. Lower cost healthcare. That the way to get all of these good things is to get rid of, to sort of deregulate, to get rid of these bottlenecks. And in some ways they're right. Or on some of their points they're right. On some of them I think they're wrong. But fundamentally I think our argument is it's kind of small potatoes. And that if what you want is abundance that provides new technologies, new jobs, greater income, less poverty, a cleaner earth, there are bigger bottlenecks than government regulations. Specifically the consolidation of industry and the rise of oligarchy that we see around us.
All right, so let's. I want to just sort of examine this just a little bit more from their perspective, and we'll go through, because I think you've in your piece in the Washington Monthly, I think you steelman their arguments pretty well, and then we can go through the various sectors. I think relatively quickly in terms of what they're proposing and how I think the small bore potatoes. It's not just, you're not seeing the forest for the trees. It's like you're taking a tree and it's as if you're taking a small, a small seedling and making it into a redwood. But with that said, when you're talking about getting rid of, like, greasing the wheels of government, and I know you were a Clinton speechwriter way back when, the first administration, I guess the only in retrospect, the idea of big government being over was from the early 90s. The idea of cutting government waste and getting rid of extra regulation, I think of Cass Sunstein during the Obama years. This does not seem particularly new in terms of an idea. I mean, just the only thing that's new is that it's gotten a fresh injection of, the Nicholson Center has moved, or our politics have moved to the right sufficiently that Nicholson is now in the center. This used to be but there's a lot of libertarian money involved in this. The Koch brothers, the tech sort of people. I mean, it seems like it's just a rebrand in many respects, broadly speaking. Then we can go through the specifics.
I think that's fair. And some of what Bill Clinton did with reinventing government, is similar to some of what they're saying, and some of what Bill Clinton did actually worked, right? He gave permission for bureaucrats to have more judgment, to overcome some procedures, and under that umbrella, the Veterans Health Administration became the best healthcare in the country. Totally socialized healthcare, by the way. And the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, went from a catastrophic laughingstock to a very effective agency. So there are things you can champion in government agency reform that are worth championing. And Niskanen Center and these other guys, Ezra Klein and the others, they champion some of that stuff, and we give them credit for that. But unfortunately, they also champion in some ideas that I don't think are going to achieve the goals that they themselves set out to achieve. And
I want to get to that part because you do it step by step. But I guess what I'm at is that, like, the idea of we should have we should look at how certain regulations function. And if we see that they're not effective, we should change them. Seems to be just a very reasonable approach to anything, right? Yeah. I mean, like, we even do that. Everybody does that in their daily life. Right. I'm not getting to work on time. If I take this, the number 2 bus, I should switch to the number 3 bus. But when you start to make it a prescription that is universally applicable, it seems to me then it moves into an ideological project.
Yes. And that's the danger here.
Yeah.
My friend Mike Lofgren said that getting into a bidding war with Republicans over deregulation is kind of like getting into a hot dog eating contest with Joey Chestnut. You're just going to lose.
Right.
And so much of what has gone wrong in this world, in this country, so much of the problem they themselves, the abundance liberals, lay out is the result of previous deregulation, right? So yes, some regulations need to be tweaked, eliminated, reformed, but we've had more deregulation than we've had regulation over the last 40 years, and what's that got us?
Right, but that's and I want to get into the specifics too. What's odd about this to me, just to give people a perspective on it, is that progressive housing reforms already do talk about eliminating certain regulations. And again, we will get into the specifics, but it feels like they're taking the 4th bullet point on what a lot of left-wingers have already discussed and broadening it into making it the emphasis, which is that it should be, it's a libertarian framework. We should be cutting red tape. We should be making things more efficient. Agree. But for a lot of people who are looking at the consolidation of wealth as the biggest problem in this country, that's point E or point F, right, on the bullet points. So I'm, I guess, a bit skeptical about the timing of this, because as we're seeing Bernie Sanders and AOC go across the country and turn out tens of thousands of people with a economically populist agenda that puts workers and wages first and breaking up the oligarchy first, to have this presented as the alternative vision feels quite deliberate to me and not the best thing for our politics in this moment.
Well, it is. I think you've laid out the stakes and the battle quite precisely. On the one hand, you have, Bernie and AOC out talking about the oligarchy and what it's doing to destroy government. And on the other hand, you have people in the Democratic Party, especially the donor class, especially those Democrats who really feel burned by the left. They think Democrats might have won if it hadn't been for the progressives, and the battle lines. And they're glomming on to this to this abundance liberalism thing with equal fervor.
Mm-hmm.
But they're doing it in op-eds and Substacks and in fundraising dinners. It's not a mass thing. Whether it can be, who knows? But
doubtful.
That's kind of where the stakes are right now.
Well, I want to circle back to this because I don't know how broad the public support was for a reconstituting our antitrust regime that we had prior to Ronald Reagan and the Borkian antitrust. But what it was a concerted effort over the course of almost a decade. In fact, a decade, I would say, of this kind of stuff. They didn't have someone who was that big of a champion that had the New York Times, a big piece of a plot of land on the real estate on the New York Times op-ed. But it was this type of thing. So by the time Elizabeth Warren had influence in Biden's office, all of these people came in the form of Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor and whatnot. And this is how you get agendas into administrations, by starting 4 or 5 years out, because obviously nothing's going to happen for the next 4 years. So let's get to sort of like what I appreciate about your piece is it is completely a nuts and bolts, I don't want to say evisceration, but certainly a weakening of the sort of like factual basis of their arguments. I just have this one sort of like quote from, I'll read that quote from Ezra Klein on his book tour in a minute, but let's get to this. You start and they start with housing. This is where abundance. So walk through their primary sort of like, I guess, focus on housing is in, frankly, like coastal elite areas, I guess, because they say it's the most productive, these areas, right, which is probably true, economically anyways, although I'm not sure that should be the grounds for making sure that people can afford housing.
Project.
But it's where it's also most expensive, so it's harder for people there, supposedly. I mean, I think, those metro areas get bigger and bigger, it seems to me. But what do they get wrong in this? Or what do they propose and what's wrong about it?
So let's start with what they get right. Housing prices are extraordinarily high. Rents are high. We have underproduced housing for the last 10 years. We overproduced housing for the previous 10 years, and we got, a collapse of the global financial system. Now we've underproduced housing, and it's part of what you see as the backlash that strengthened Trump. So they're right about the underproduction of housing. They are right that much of it is driven by local zoning ordinances. And, in particular, zoning ordinances that prescribe only single-family detached homes as opposed to apartments. And they are part of a movement, the YIMBY movement, that is very strong among millennials, people living in these very high rent, high price coastal metro areas, that said, look, I ought to have the right. It's a libertarian idea. I ought to have the right to build anything I want on my piece of property.
Yes, in my backyard.
In my backyard, exactly. And in theory, right, if you could eliminate all zoning and anybody could build anything anywhere, the market theory would say, yes, you would have a whole lot of housing. And I grew up in suburbs. I live in the suburbs. I know the suburbs pretty well. If somebody wanted to build a 2-flat or a 4-flat in my neighborhood, I'd be fine with that. The problem with Ezra and Ezra Klein, Matt Iglesias, Yoni Applebaum, and Jerusalem Demzis, and some of the other thinkers here, is we've already now tried these reforms for several years in California, in Oregon, in Minneapolis. And the end result is we've gotten a trickle of new houses in the form of sort of apartment buildings and granny flats, not very much. But what we have also gotten is tremendous backlash against the people in these neighborhoods, because 9 out of 10 of them would say, if you built a 4-flat in, next to me, who knows what kind of low-income people are going to come in and where they're going to park their cars, and can the schools handle it, and the traffic. People hate it. People just hate it. So it becomes an enormously difficult project to happen, and the backlash that you're likely to get is just beyond what you can imagine. And so what these guys are doing is provoking senior Democratic elected officials and donors into an agenda that is going to have unbelievable blowback among voters. And what's really tragic is it doesn't need to happen. You don't have to fight that fight.
I just want to be clear. So, we have evidence that their stated goal is unachieved because there are other problems, and we'll talk in a moment about what those problems are. But B, as a political matter, the return on investment is lousy because, there are going to be proposals that any political party pursues where there's going to be blowback. And if it sufficiently provides what it is supposedly going to provide, I think in certain situations, in many, frankly, depending on what the goals are, blowback is fine, because if you give enough people, what they need, those people who are going to be upset because it's somehow sort of like they perceive it as diminishes from them. That's what politics are. That's what it seems to me. It's like the space is not going to grow on trees, and sort of density doesn't grow on trees. They want to sell federal lands to put housing on there. The Trump administration said this. Well, there's a reason why there's no housing. There's a reason why federal government has those lands more often than not. It's because no one else wanted them. And the cost of both to like the individuals living there and to society to sort of make those spaces habitable is incredibly extreme. So
yeah, no, it's not a good idea, but there are good ideas that are adjacent to what these abundance liberals are saying. In fact, some of them have agreed with us for 15 years to do this, and that is, don't lift zoning restrictions on residential neighborhoods. Lift them on commercial property near transit. When cities and suburbs have done that, they've gotten an explosion of what they call walkable communities, apartment buildings, condos, tall buildings where people can find restaurants and grocery stores and hop on a bus or hop on a metro. That really works. If you walk around DC, you see it everywhere. And to give you an example, in Minneapolis, which is a city that kind of epitomizes the great abundance liberal experiment, they eliminated zoning in single family residential neighborhoods, and they got very, very little in the last few years that they've tried it, new permits for new apartment buildings. But they also lifted the size restrictions from 6 stories to 30 in commercial properties near transit. And they got 20,000 housing units. And that made the rent increases in Minneapolis a fraction of what they have been in the state, and actually lowered the homeless population in Minneapolis, even as it went up in the state as a whole. And, there are other examples of that around the country. So again, abundance liberals aren't against what I just said. It's that they're also for having unnecessary, provocative, and fights that aren't literally going to deliver what they say they're going to deliver.
When characterize this at a 30,000 foot level, because when I hear that the solution is just a blanket get rid of regulations and invite the supply side to come in and make profits off of this. The thing that just rattles around in my head is the way that Barack Obama dealt with the banks in the wake of the financial crisis, right? You have a choice. Very explicit, was outlined, and supposedly, we've talked on this program many, many times. Barney Frank telling the story about Paul, I can't, it's the Paulson. Was it Paulson or? No, it wasn't Geithner. I think it was Paulson. But Obama was, faced with a choice. In fact, Bush was on some level too, I guess, at the end. I can either go to the supply side, which is the banks providing the mortgages, and bail them out and hope they do the right thing. Or I can take the hope out of the equation and just bail out the homeowners. They already have an obligation to pay the money to the banks. So if I give the money to the homeowners, I know where that money is going to go. It's going to go to the banks because the pipes are already there. But if I give the money to the banks, I'm just hoping that I've guessed their incentive structure right. And it sounds like, at least in terms of like the housing, they're just hoping that they understand that the incentive structure, and it's clear they don't. I'm not saying I do, but we can determine, it seems to me that we as a government, regulation, non-regulation, in many respects is always the same thing. It's a government action. You deregulate or regulate. It's just a question of, are you doing it in a way where you have less guesswork as to what's going to happen?
Yeah. And another way of looking at it is, who writes the rules? The abundance liberals are angry at local governments for writing rules that have excluded people from their suburbs, from their cities, from their neighborhoods, through this strict zoning. And I understand there are whole wings of libraries full of books about how bad exclusionary zoning is, racist, classist. It's terrible. But we've been doing it for 100 years, right? It's not a new problem. And so you can go to war with local governments, which more or less reflect the voters who live there, and side with, the state government or the mayor or the federal government and say, we're going to come in and we're going to take away your regulatory power and we're going to impose our regulatory power. Either way, it's regulation. And I can make a moral argument either way. I can make a practical argument either way, but somebody's got to write the rules. So to your point, there are smart rules and dumb rules. There are rules that are written with democratic input and rules that are written by private entities, right? Some work out, some don't. There's not an ideological thing here, but it deeply practical.
It seems to me, and let's move on to, let's say, infrastructure. But the thing is, and I will admit that I have yet to get very far in the abundance books whatsoever. For the most part, I've been reading reviews. But there is, even in, like, as you tell this story of like there is one consistent sort of like player in this that doesn't seem to ever get sort of like pinpointed. I mean, it does in your critique on some level, in terms of we're talking about monopolies and we're talking about corporate power. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, to the extent that there's any distortion in the regulatory frameworks of localities or states or in any other place, to the extent there's any, what they would call distortion or short-sightedness insofar as it's not supporting a broader population, it's because of concentration of wealth. It's because of money. Always.
Yeah. Look, one of the reasons housing is unaffordable in, say, San Francisco or New York is that so many people with so much money have bid up the prices to the point where nobody else can afford it, right? This is an inequality argument, right? You could get rid of the zoning tomorrow and you have that problem. And here's the thing, Sam and Emma, if somehow we take this problem on and we eliminate, we try to go after local single-family zoning, do you think the wealthy neighborhoods are going to let apartments in? Right? No. You think they're not going to use their money and their lawyers to keep that out? Where are the apartment buildings going to go? They're going to go to middle-class neighborhoods. They're going to go to lower middle-class neighborhoods. Those are the people that don't have the lawyers to keep them out. Those are the people who don't control their local officials the way the wealthy do. So what the abundance liberals kind of agree with you. They say, yes, this is rich progressives who are hypocrites who say they care about the poor, but then won't let housing be built in their neighborhoods. Well, sure, but
I would argue it's rich people broadly. It's rich people broadly. Some of the progressives may be hypocrites, but it's rich people broadly that are not doing that.
Conservatives with big fancy McMansions don't want, apartment buildings in their neighborhood as much or more than progressives, in big McMansions.
But I guess my question is here, like is there any discussion of like Sheldon Whitehouse, I think, introduced a housing bill just last year to fund via the low-income housing tax credit, expanding that. Doesn't seem to be a focus on that. Or last year, there was legislation in the House and then in the Senate that would bar hedge funds from buying up a bunch of homes, which has also driving up the cost of housing. Like, it seems to me that there's a lot of free market solutions and very little taking on of the corporate interest in the commodification of housing. And like, it just feels extremely out of date. Like, it feels like this conversation could have been had, as Sam was saying earlier, in the 90s, where, I'm sorry, at minimum, we need a Keynesian economic model, if not a broad decommodification of housing. And I think almost the entire Democratic Party is there. So the question is, what is this book about, if not just to reify, frankly, the focus on suburban, disaffected Republicans that has killed Democrats in this last election cycle?
Yeah, when you bring up with these folks the issue of hedge funds purchasing housing in middle and lower middle class neighborhoods and turning it into rental units, and then companies being charged with it, in some cases successfully prosecuted on price fixing, they're going to say that's an excuse. That's something you want to talk about because you don't want to talk about the importance of building new housing and market solutions. So they kind of deflect. The other thing that they absolutely don't talk about until you push them, and then they have a different, is one of the big problems with housing costs today is the shrinkage in the number of home builders. It's, since the financial collapse, the number of home builders in any particular metro area has shrunk remarkably. And there's data that show that the fewer competing home builders, the fewer units, the higher the price. And they'll come back with arguments that, well, the big ones can handle the zoning, the little ones can't. Maybe true, maybe not. But they really don't really believe in that. They don't disbelieve in the low income housing credit but that's not where they think the problem is, and that's not where they want to put the emphasis.
Let's take one more topic, because we've, sort of vaguely, but you really sort of like section by section go through infrastructure. We saw this, you talk about the high-speed rail in California that ostensibly was, environmentally reviewed to death. It seems to me we always have the same problem that is sort of like there's this poltergeist in all of these things. Like, who is environmentally, the implication as if it's like, it's just the people who love the spotted owls. They're stopping this high-speed train, et cetera, as opposed to, and I think they would argue, well, this is what's problematic with regulations, being weaponized by wealthy interests, whether it's the Koch brothers who don't want, the purple line in where is it? In
Maryland, yeah,
in Maryland. They don't want the purple line. They don't want broad-based public transport.
Yeah.
From an ideological perspective. Their idea is one that is so libertarian in its structure that it's almost shocking to me, because I would have these arguments back in the tens where it was like, you have corporations who are corrupting our government, and the solution from libertarians is you need to shrink government.
Yeah.
So that it doesn't have the ability to impact these areas. That way, corporations will come in and corrupt it. It's like, well, wait a second.
Either way.
Yeah, well, of course. And it's sort of like you're basically saying shoot the cancer victim as a way of killing the cancer. And that doesn't make sense. You need to shrink the cancer with maintaining the health of the host. And so, again, it's like a almost a pathological desire to hide the ball in terms of like what are regulations set up to do? Where is this friction happening? There's surely times where it's like, this regulation is stupid, but more often than not, it is the exploitation of people who have so much money that for them at the end of the day, it just becomes like a balancing test as to where to, extend their resources. Let's talk about healthcare, because I thought this was also sort of like an interesting sort of avoidance of what is the most obvious way to constrain and provide healthcare benefits to as many people as possible. But talk about their ideas when it comes to healthcare.
So you're right that they have this sort of libertarian attitude that it's constraint imposed by government regulation that is the root cause of our inability to have nice things. In healthcare, their argument is the doctors' lobby constricts the number of physicians and the number of residential posts that are funded by the government in order to keep their incomes up, which is true. They do that. And so it follows, they say, that if we increase the number of doctors in various ways, that will lower healthcare costs. And if if healthcare were a proper functioning market economy, there might be some truth to that. But We don't, right? The healthcare markets are not as the textbooks describe for a whole lot of reasons, but most recently because the providers of healthcare, the hospitals, have become monopolies. In 75% of metro areas, a local hospital has 50% or more of the beds. And the hospitals don't just control the beds, they own the doctors' practices. They own the blood labs. In many cases, they own the insurance companies. So they're imposing prices, right? You can add all the doctors you want, and it's going to have no real effect on bringing down the cost of healthcare. And for reasons I don't understand, because I know these folks, they've written for my magazine, I've known them for years. They're very reluctant to talk about concentration of industry the way I just did. And they're just much more comfortable, with these imaginary tweaks that they can make, to supply and regulation. And it's frustrating.
It's interesting because the healthcare dynamic is very, it is odd. Like you write about, hammer, when everything's when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And I still remember this piece by Atul Gawande, which must have been now 15 years ago, where he compared Medicare reimbursement rates in two different towns in Texas and found that, doctors who own their own MRIs, for instance, they use the MRI a lot more than maybe other doctors did who didn't have it, because you have it there, you use it, you got a loan on it, you're paying it off, and so you're going to use it as much as you can. You're going to bill your clients that way, and without a sort of the cost constraints of the reimbursements.
Yes.
So that nationally we can assess, in this instance, the MRI was not warranted. They're just using it because they have the machine.
Yeah.
It's the opposite on some level when you talk about this consolidation, because we could let in a lot of doctors from India, from around the world, who are trained doctors, just as competent as any doctor coming out of a U.S. School. And we could have a lot more doctors in here without having the capital that could come from a government, essentially, whose interest is to provide healthcare as opposed to make profit. They would have no ability to set up a practice or have an ability to serve, maybe very basic general practitioner stuff. But we need to have an investment and a protection within the system where profit is not the primary motive of owning a hospital.
High on a hill was a lonely goat herd.
That was apropos, but it wasn't on purpose. But there's a complete, it's as if that concept is completely not even on the table for them.
Yeah, you bring in more doctors, you get more knee surgeries. You raise costs, you don't lower costs. I mean, not always, but that's kind of the tendency of healthcare. As you said,
but that's a function of our inability to have a cohesive system. It's just because it's a profit motive business.
This is why the Washington Monthly has been proposing for a number of years a healthcare reform called Medicare Prices for All. It's not Medicare for all. It's not an expansion of healthcare. It's a government imposition of prices, because we no longer have a market that sets prices. We have monopoly institutions that give us prices with no ability to push back. And if you work, if you're in the workforce, you 99% chance you get or 95% chance you get your health care from your employer, right? You're paying double, triple what somebody on Medicare is paying. And doctors who take Medicare, they make plenty of money. The hospitals that take Medicare, they make money. But those who are on commercial care, they make tons of money. That's why every hospital's building multiple wings. If the government says from now on, every knee surgery, same price. Every doctor visit to your primary care, same price. You get the Medicare price. The end result of that is thousands of dollars in the pocket of the average family, because so much of what would have been their wage increases has been going to pay for their health care coverage, and then being siphoned off into this, giant consolidated developer, hospital industrial complex. Now, if you're talking to a Democratic donor about things like that, they're gonna be horrified, especially if they're doctors. But for the average person, that's going to give them direct benefit much quicker than and more with more certainty than anything that the abundance liberals are talking about.
And it also seems to me that when you impose, in this instance, you're basically talking about cost controls. And it's basically price fixing based upon a lot of data as to what these things should cost. What it also does, in my mind, which it gives it durability, is it begins to decrease the concentration of wealth on the supply side, and therefore diminishes the political power of these people to further extract from our government and our public kitty, as it were. I mean, personally, I also can't stand the paperwork. And so, the fact that we're getting a slightly, it's costing me less is great. But I also don't want to have to work for this. I don't want to have a second job as filling out and making sure that I'm getting my reimbursements or, keep up with the latest, like are people in network or out of network. I just want everybody to be in network. But I guess as an interim step, for me, one of the biggest features of antitrust is that it begins to decrease wealth concentration and political power concentration. And then it opens up the opportunity to do things in a much more efficient way, it seems to me.
The thing about the abundance liberal folks is I think all of their books went to press before Donald Trump was inaugurated.
100%.
Yes.
100%.
And now they come out with what really has been a years-long kind of campaign to raise the salience, and they're very open about it. And again, these are friends of mine. They want abundance liberalism to be if not the defining faction of the Democratic Party, and they're doing it at a time when the oligarchs have taken control of the federal government and destroying the agencies which they claim to want to fix.
Right.
It's
We're
really
about to find out if it's helpful to have no regulation, in the USDA and the FDA and whatnot. There's either an ideology that we can leave this up to corporate America, or there's one in which we need to have, government constraining corporate power and corporate accumulation of wealth.
And can I just say, it's not just antitrust. Antitrust is an important tool. But when you look at what's keeping us from building the electric transmissions infrastructure that can bring us a clean energy future, the abundance liberals people point to federal environmental statutes that have been weaponized to stop these things. And they're not wrong. This is one of those occasions where, we need to have some reform of federal statute. But the biggest constraint is investor-owned electric utility monopolies. They make their money, right, burning fossil fuels and getting a percentage. Solar doesn't cost anything once you build it. It has high upfront costs, but virtually zero fuel costs. And so they're under the model we have now for private electric utilities. They see solar as a threat to their business model. So, antitrust isn't the right tool for that. You know what the right tool is? Create a Tennessee Valley Authority.
Yep.
Nationalize in some form or another. Yes.
Yes. What did FDR do to force the electric companies to wire the poor parts of the country? He created a government agency that said, we're going to do it if you don't. We'll steer your business.
Right.
And that got their attention. FDR called it the birch rod in the cupboard. You pull it out and you threaten. And we need to create new agencies to go after this corporate power. And, to me, that is just a practical a step that most Americans could understand.
And I guess maybe it's a good place for us to wrap here. Just the political implications of this, Paul, if you have a sense, because it's hard to discern. Is this just a book tour, and a poorly timed one? But when I see Josh Shapiro tweeting out, "I'm doing the abundance agenda," I am concerned about the Democratic Party going in this direction once again, when we could be drawing a very explicit contrast with Donald Trump right now and advocating for government. This is largely it's not anti-government, but it's a critique of government regulations. And I just can't think of a time when it would be worse to make that argument and have the party embrace parts of that argument. It is a hard question, and I don't have a crystal ball. If you look at Ezra Klein himself did an interview with a pollster named Daniel Shore, who tested all of Kamala Harris's ads. And the ad that moved voters the most was the one that said, we're going to go after the landlords for high prices. Yep.
And we're going to go after the price gougers for high grocery prices. Right? That's what voters care about. And the abundance liberals are they're tapping into that energy on the housing front. But are their means going to be ones that average voters care about? It seems to me no, and that average voters are much more likely to understand that large corporations jack up prices because they have power, and they have power in the government, and they're corrupting everything. That's an easier sell to me, not a politician, than saying we're going to come after your zoning and put buildings there when you moved in you weren't there. So we'll see. But I will tell you, this is hot in the donor class among
I know
those Democrats who don't want to confront corporate power. This is a built-in way to be for something that voters want without, going after
having to
power
address them. All right. So one really last question about the timing, because I really, it feels to me there is an analogy between the abundance sort of like intellectual movement, if you will, and where antitrust was in 2015 and a half or 2016, which is, I think the antitrust people thought there was going to be an opportunity to inject antitrust people into the Clinton administration, Hillary Clinton administration. That never happened. And I suspect this was the same thing, that we've got the people. I mean, in fact, you can look at the donor class memos, third way memos, like this is what they were intending on pushing. I suspect that there was an idea that we're going to put the personnel into the Harris administration. And here is the sort of blueprint for that, ideological, they claim it's non, but it is an ideology, thrust. So, this is
I think that's right.
Who were the people?
About the only outfit that was pushing antitrust in 2015 was the Washington Monthly and one or two tiny think tanks. We had nothing like the donor support and the buy-in,
of course. But you did have, but the antitrust people did have Warren using, she plays an inside game, and she's very good at that. And
she so recognized Lena Khan, who started out writing for the Washington Monthly, as somebody that they could, I think that's your point, put into key posts, Tim Wu and other people like that, and spark a kind of revolution.
Yes.
I think
who were those people?
Happen.
Do you have a sense that those people, prior to the election outcome, were gearing up? Like, what on the transition teams? Like, who? I could have pointed to Elizabeth Warren in 2015 or 16 and say, like, this is maybe it's much clearer in hindsight, but there was a sense of like there is a Warren, universe. And I think we probably interviewed Lena Khan sometime around there in 2015, multiple times, and Barry Lynn and Stoller and the whole crew. But who are those people outside of like, Ezra Klein and like, are there? Do you see those people, or no, are they obscure?
I think you mentioned the Niskanen Center. It's my friend Steve Tallis is a leading light among these abundance liberals. He's written whole long essays, being very explicit about his political aims. He wants to capture the Democratic Party for these ideas. And again, some of them aren't bad. His stuff on building the capacity of bureaucracies is very, very good. But, and they have, I'm sure, people in mind who would have staffed a Kamala Harris administration. And remember, Kamala Harris came out in favor of abundance liberalism. She talked about building more housing. Barack Obama talked about it. So they had already made, pretty good progress in, insinuating themselves into the leadership of the Democratic Party.
Paul Glastris, we will link to your piece, The Meager Agenda of Abundance Liberals, at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
I really appreciate you having me on.
Thanks so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.